Hello, YouTube. Hello, hello. So, I got convinced by some people in chat to make this insane document because a big thing that I've noticed, at least from playing Wrestling and streaming and stuff, is a lot of people really struggle with understanding what to upgrade in the character, how to upgrade the character, how to progress, how to just become stronger and get through the time walks and reach profound, reach deep space, sometimes even just reach time walk 8. So instead of trying to make this like get all guide of it's like, oh, buy this, then this, and you'll have a great time, I
Meow,
thought it would
meow,
make a
meow.
lot more sense to just explain how the game works. And this document is exactly that. How is damage calculated? How does it work? How do I put this all together? How can you as a person look at your own build and figure out what's going to be the best upgrade? So, the first thing this document covers is the concept of additional damage. Additional damage in this game might not always work the way that people think it does, but I think it's very important to understand. So, there's actually a tooltip in the game that explains damage calculations. And what this basically says is that, okay, you have a base amount of damage, and you're going to multiply this with every single form of damage increase percent that you have, which is then going to be multiplied with your additional damage, your additional damage increase, which is multiplied with another additional damage, which is another one, another one, another one, another one. And the important thing to note is that every source of additional damage is its own multiplier, and they all multiply with each other. So, what that means is that if you have two sources of 25% additional damage, you're not getting 50% more damage. You have two sources, 25% more, 25% more. That's not going to give you 50% more. That's going to give you 56.25% more. Because if we multiply 1.25 with 1.25, it is 1.56, which is the formula that they're giving us in the game. And the way we use that is instead of, getting one big source of additional damage, it is a lot better to spread out a bunch of sources of additional damage because they're all multiplying each other and the actual amount of damage you're gaining goes up substantially. So, why is this relevant to us? I think a big issue that a lot of players have in this game when they're trying to upgrade their character, when they're trying to progress, is that they tend to neglect very important parts of the character that is giving them a lot of damage that they're just not tapping into. What I mean by that is, I've seen people who link me their POBs, the build codes, and like, please help me, how do I get more damage and stuff? And then I'll look at their gear, and they're gonna have a bunch of tier 0 modifiers. And then I click on the hero memory, and the hero memory has a tier 3 mod and a tier 2 mod. And both the mods is like completely useless mods. Or like it's like percent increased damage, like a very low weighting, very bad mod that doesn't have a lot of effect on it. So what do I exactly mean when I say like upgrading every aspect of your character? Well, you need to upgrade your gear. You need to make sure your gear is well crafted for the time walk you're in. In time walk 7, everything should be tier 2. In time walk 8, you want to get everything to tier 1. And then eventually from there, you want to upgrade with items that have good base implicits, not random trash ones. You actually want good ones. You don't need the best ones, but like if you're playing a deck stacker and you have base implicit int, that is worthless. Just buy one with base implicit dex then. And then you can start upgrading that to tier 1s. And tier 0s are so expensive that they're an upgrade you should push back to later. Okay? And another important thing is uniques. What uniques do you use? You always need to weigh the cost of the unique relative to a crafted item and the cost of that crafted item. What that means is early on, it's very easy to just throw a bunch of uniques in your build and then, everything just works together. But generally speaking, it is going to be a lot better to have crafted uniques. The reason why you see every player just have a bunch of uniques in a build is because when you're like rushing to Time Walk 7, you don't actually get enough resources to craft a bunch of perfect items. So it's just a lot better to have access to, uniques that are powerful. Because these uniques, relatively speaking, are just very cheap. But like a good example of a good unique that you should have later in the game is Thunder Manipulators. Now, Thunder Manipulators are going to be giving us 70% additional damage against numbed enemies, at least 70%. It is very difficult to justify wearing gloves because the amount of damage and res that you're getting from these gloves simply are so high that any rare gloves you use are just not going to be nearly as good as them. And then another important thing is don't neglect your belt affixes. Don't forget your dream affixes. Just having these on your gear is essentially free, even if it's not the best one, even if it's not the perfect one. Not having it is just losing damage for no reason at all. And then, of course, candles. The amount of times that I see people that have like 2 1-mod candles and then they have a bunch of T0 bots in their guild is absurd. You should put currency into your candles. Your candles can have various strong modifiers on them, such as 12% additional lightning damage, 16% additional damage while staying still, 30% numb effect, all sorts of modifiers like that that are very, very powerful. But also, your candles can do important things, such as fixing your blessing generation, which, going from no blessings to having blessings is absurdly good. It is so much additional damage that you're gaining, and even tankiness that you're gaining. It can help you increase your curse limit, and adding additional curse to your build is essentially adding like another 30% additional. And you can also get some main talents, such as like full defense, control spell, things like that on your candles. So they're very important to occasionally upgrade and not fall behind on. And another big one is your memories. For starters, when you buy your hero memories, it is very difficult to get like an insane 2-modded red memory. I know it's difficult. But at the very least, you should at least get like a good mod and a decent mod. If your memory is fucking a tier 3 crit and minion crit, and you're playing a non-minion build, that's just a dead mod. You are just down a full modifier of attributes. You can instead have like a tier 2 crit and maybe crit damage. A tier 2 crit, damage percent. Tier 2 crit, energy shield. Anything like that is better than just having a dead modifier. Okay? And another thing, roll your hero memories. Don't just have these purple or sometimes even don't just have these purple hero memories that are like not even leveled up, or if they are leveled up, they just have like tier 3. Just spend a tiny bit and just roll them. Now, I'm not saying you should roll your purple ones, but you should definitely at least have orange hero memories and try to get at least tier 2 modifiers on them, like crit damage and crit rating. And later on, you definitely want to upgrade them to red and get tier 0, tier 1 mods on them. Okay? It's so much damage you're losing out by not having them. Kismet's a new mechanic. A lot of people seem to just forget about them. Always have 9 micros. Always have 4 mediums. It doesn't matter if you just fucking put in 9 dex micros and 4 dex mediums, you know? They're still stronger than anything your pack spreads are giving you. And you can put them on points on your pack spreads that are just not very good. Because not all pack spreads are created equally. Some of them just have dead points in them. You absolutely need to always have 9 micros and 4 mediums in. And then as you progress with gear, you should try picking up undetermineds. Early on, just getting like an undetermined with 1 small is going to be very cheap. And that's just an extra small. It's quite good to have. And eventually, you can start getting like better undetermineds. You can start working on getting strong Deokismets that are like building aiming, like getting Megasis on Deokismets, getting focus skills on your kismets, etc., as well as like eventually setting up a sword drop act. These are very powerful for any sort of stacker. If you're Ore stacker, you get sealed mana compensation. If you're Dex stacker, you get a bunch of Dex nodes. Next up, canvas your skills. A big thing that I've noticed is people just don't level up the canvas support. You're just missing out on 20% additional damage on 2 of your supports. For no reason. That's a fuck ton of damage. Do not have because you don't want to level them up. You don't need to get them to level 5. Even just level 4 is good, and it's way cheaper. But like, you should be leveling them up. They're not that expensive to level up. Something that might be expensive this league is getting like level 21 base skill, level 21 supports. Especially level 21 base skill, that's essentially just 8% additional damage. Occasionally you should just test out your stuff, make sure you're actually using the best setup. Maybe try and math it out if needed. And of course, you should be efficient with your passive skills. If you're running like a 50% aura, a 20%, a 20%, and 10%, and then you have like 20% unreserved mana, there's potential there to optimize, to fit more into your passive skills, to get more out of your mana, because you want to get that mana down to fucking 0. You want that shit to be as reserved as possible, because every single point of mana is potential damage that we're missing out on. And obviously, late game, you eventually should upgrade to the precise versions of skills. It is essentially just free damage to not have, and generally it's not even that expensive. Okay. Pack spirits, not much to say about this. You get free boxes, you get free pulls. Try to get better pack spirits for the build. If you don't have them, you don't have them. Not much you can do about it. But if you do get them, it's pretty nice. And especially with them giving us so many free pulls, definitely like study up, find out what pack spirit is good for your build, and get them. And before anyone asks, there's no 3 pack spirits that is like the be all end all for E2. It depends on the build. However, I do use hamster in every single build. Backup power battery, I do use that in every single build. Okay, this one's a big one. Slates. You should have slates on. I mean, like, you will literally drop them yourself just progressing to Time Walk 7 and to Time Walk 8. You have no excuse to not have slates equipped at all times. Because even having just one random mod on your slate is still a lot of damage that you're missing out on if you don't have it equipped. But it's also very important to like constantly upgrade your slates and work on them. So a big thing is like early on, before you have prayer and all those things, you still want to be getting yourself 2 modded slates. It doesn't need to be 2 modded legendary slates. It can be like dex percent and then flat dex. You know, that's still good. Or it can be dex percent and like 6% attack speed. Like even something like that is still better than just nothing. But then on top of that, ideally you have like 2 legendary mods, and then you also roll them by branding them. So what I mean by branding them is you can actually craft on slates, and you can like upgrade the modifiers on them. And I definitely think it's worth it to not only upgrade everything to purple, but if you have any legendary slots, to just send a shot in the dark, because maybe you get lucky. It's a low investment gamble, and sometimes the payoff can be worth it. You can get some very strong modifiers from it. Getting yourself like some decent 2 modded slates is going to carry you tremendously through the early game. Because each and every one of these slate mods is like a 10% additional modifier that you're just not having by not using them. And then eventually, you know, you can also upgrade them to buying 2 modded corners, you can buy 1 modded starlights, you can get prairies, you can get mobs, things like that. Don't be stupid about it though. A well-crafted 4 modded 4 slate is better than a 1 mod corner. If you have corners that have just 1 modifier on them, that is just not good. It's not terrible, but it's just not very good. You know, try to be smart about your slates. Another thing, this is something that I've seen a ton of people come to my channel and do. Prairies and mobs copy the last talent, okay? The last talent on the slate. So if the set has 4 talents listed, if the set has 2 talents listed, it copies the last one that is listed, okay? If the last one says max divinity 1, you cannot copy it. It is a dead mod. You cannot copy it. You're wasting your prey / moth by trying to copy it, okay? Don't do that. It is infuriating to see. Then another big decision that you need to make in your build is, are you going to run a Rift Slate or a Pedigree of the Gods? Generally speaking, a Rift Slate is more powerful than a Pedigree of Gods. I think this season the balance is shifted up a bit more, where they're trying to make pedigrees better. Moreover, for some builds, a Pedigree of the Gods is pretty much build enabling, and you do need it. As well as if you have a two modded Pedigree of the Gods, that can actually outperform Rift Slates in some builds. Okay? But if you're using a Pedigree of the Gods, either Rift Slates need to be absurdly expensive like last season, or you need to have 2 very strong modifiers on your Pedigree of the Gods. Okay? Another thing, just try to not waste space. I think like a very common setup to do on the Pedigree of the Gods, to do on your trade talents, is to have a Pedigree of the Gods and then 4 Force Slates. If you do that setup, you do have 1 slot open. Instead of one of those Force Slates, just take it out. Put a corner and a Fallen Starlight in. You know? Instead of having like 1 ideal mod and then like 3 okay mods, you can just have like 2 ideal mods and 1 okay mod. You know? Just tiny things like that adds up, and it does matter. And then lastly, try to optimize your tree. Don't be stupid with the tree. Generally, people are just copying someone else's build. You need to understand that sometimes like I, for example, will make decisions on my tree based on my current gear and my current setup. And the things that I do might not be most optimal for you, but it's also fine. You know, it's not that big of a deal if you're not absolutely 100% perfect. The much bigger deal, though, is do your path of progression. This is how you get skill points. Do not slack on path of progression. Constantly look at it. Do the objectives. Get those skill points. You're missing out on power by just not doing it. Okay? And don't get stuck at a low level. Level up. Get those extra points. Okay. That was a lot of rambling about like what upgrades to do. How the fuck do you know what to upgrade? How the fuck do you do that? Okay? The first important concept to understand is additional damage versus increased % damage. So you'll have items like Thunder Manipulators that have 70% additional damage on them, and then you'll have like talents to give you like 54% increased damage. How does that work? Well, going back to the damage calculator, every single source of increased % damage is all additive of each other. They all get added together and turn into one big multiplier. So if you have 500% 500% increased damage, that is essentially the same as having 1 modifier that says 500% additional damage. But as we discussed at the start of the thing, instead of having 1 50% modifier, it is better to have 2 25%. And that same logic applies here. Increased % damage is a good mod to have, but too much of anything becomes bad. If you go from 200% to 300% increased damage, you are essentially getting 50% more damage. You know, that's a 50% additional modifier. However, going from 800% to 900% is only a 12% increase. And all of a sudden, you know, that 100% increased damage is pretty expensive for only a 12% additional modifier. Because generally speaking, a 12% additional modifier is going to be way cheaper to get. Which is essentially just to say that too much of anything is a bad thing. And all of your like increased % damage gets thrown into the same bucket. And that one big bucket is your additional damage multiplier. It's just one of many additional damage multipliers. Well, every single additional damage multiplier gets their own bucket and they all multiply each other. Okay? And then another thing, what increased % damages work? It is simply just based off the tags. Okay? If you have a skill like Thunder Spike, if you have a skill like Thunder Spike, if your item says increased attack damage, increased lightning, increased area, increased melee, increased shadow strike, all of those is going to give your Thunder Spike more damage. But if it says increased minion, if it says increased cold, if it says, I don't know, increased spell, none of those will work on Thunder Spike, and you're essentially not getting that damage if you use Thunder Spike as your damage skill. This is important because on the new cuteness skills, like cuteness on the new focus skills, like a cuteness focus, this does not have a melee tag. So any sort of like melee increased damage will not work with a cuteness focus or thunder focus or anything like that, okay? And then the last piece of the puzzle, if we go back to damage calculation, we've talked about increased damage, we've talked about additional damage. The last piece of the puzzle is base damage. How does base damage work? How do you increase it? Where does it come from? So every skill in this game is going to have this line here. Effectiveness of added damage, okay? And then attack-based skills, or effectiveness of added damage, okay? Keep that in mind, because if you have a spell skill, okay, if you have an attack, let's start with attack-based skill. If you have an attack-based skill, it's going to have this effectiveness out of damage. Where is it getting this damage from? What is this? This damage is the physical damage on your weapon. So if your weapon has 100 physical damage, it is essentially getting transformed into 525% damage on your cuteness focus. Okay? But you can increase that damage because, as you may know, various items in this game have rules like adds 200%, 200 flat damage to your gear, adds 80 to 100 cold damage to your gear. Or for example, if you have a Ralph's Burial, that's adding flat damage for every point of tracks you have. All of this flat damage is essentially getting added to your weapon, and then all of it is getting transformed by this effectiveness of added damage. So if you have 100 flat damage and your weapon does 100 damage, you're essentially going to be doing 1,050 damage thanks to cuteness focus, and it's 525% effectiveness of added damage. And every single multiplier is based on this base damage. So base damage is very, very important to get. It doesn't matter if you have 1,000,000,000% additional damage, because if you only have one base damage, that one base damage is going from 1 to 1,000,000,000, you know? Whereas someone of 1,000,000 base damage and 1,000,000% additional damage is going infinite times over the damage cap, you know? Now that's for attack-based skills. It does work slightly differently for spell-based skills. If you look at something like Chain Lightning will still have this effectiveness of added damage, but instead of taking your weapon's base damage, because if you like look at wands stuff, it will literally have an implicit, like, you know, adds 40 base damage to your weapon, to your skills, for example. Instead of taking this like flat damage from your weapons only, spell skills will also have flat damage on top of that. So weapons don't have flat damage on top of that, they just take it from your weapon, but there's multiple ways to increase your weapons like flat damage with like fizz rolls. Spell skills take the tiny bit that your wand gives you, but they also give their own amount of flat damage. And then both of those things are also getting scaled with any other sort of flat damage that you have in your build. Because again, Ralph's Burial. You know, Ralph's Burial is going to scale up both attack skills and spell skills. So this flat damage that you're adding to your gear, and this works for everything. If you have a flat damage on shield, if you have flat damage from Cicada Shell, if you have flat damage from Ralph's Burial, if you have flat damage from mana as focus blessings, you know, anything like that, it is going to be added to the damage effectiveness that we were looking at, which on Chain Lightning is going to be 177%. That's another thing you'll notice. Spells do tend to have a bit lower effectiveness damage than attack skills, which I believe is just compensation for the fact that they also come with way more flat damage than attack skills. Okay? So that's how you calculate your damage. Now, how do you put all of this together? Like, how do you put this all together? How do you make sense of this? Basically, when you're looking at your gear, you want to try and spread your wings out to get as many sources of additional damage. Instead of worrying about getting that big upgrade, instead of spending that 10,000 FE to get a Ralph's Burial, to get this Ralph's Burial, which is going to give you like a big damage. Or let's use an even better example. Instead of spending that 2,000 FE to get the Ralph's Journey, which is going to give you, I don't know, 700% additional, you can instead get here and there 20% additional, 20% additional, 10% additional, 10% additional, 20% additional, 20% additional. And after you get like 5, 10, 15 of those, all of a sudden, this tremendous 700% additional from Ralph's Journey that cost you 2k FE is less damage and less additional than these 20 other upgrades that you put together for just 1,000 FE. Okay? The best example I have of that is I actually have a friend who, in a previous season, got to multiple trillions of damage before buying the Ralph's Burial. Because they just did a bunch of, smart and efficient upgrades. And this is only talking about increased percent damage and like additional damage. You can apply this logic to crit damage, you can apply this logic to crit rating, you can apply this logic to attack speed. If you go from hitting an enemy 10 times to only hitting them 11 times, you are essentially getting 10% more attack speed, which is essentially just 10% more damage. Because like imagine you hit for 200 per hit, you hit 10 times per second, and now instead you're hitting 11 times per second for 200. That's just a 10% increase, a 10% additional modifier. The same thing goes for crit. If you have 80% crit that do 500 damage because you have 400% crit damage, like you have 400% crit damage and 8% crit chance, then 80% of the time you're doing 500 damage, 20% of the time you're doing 100 damage because the 100 doesn't crit. That averages out to 420 damage. If you then increase that to 100% crit, now you're always doing 500 damage, so you just gained 19% damage, because going from 420 to 500 is 90% additional. So this 20% crit is essentially just 90% additional for your build. I think it's very important to like understand the logic behind this, because when you're looking at your character, it becomes a lot easier to go like, oh, this slate's only giving me 8% additional, but this one's giving me 8%, 10%, and 10% additional. This 8%, 10%, 10% slate is significantly better than this 8% slate. I should replace this 8% slate with another one that gives me, 3 modifiers or 4 modifiers. It's like way easier to think about it that way. And it then becomes a lot easier to upgrade your character as long as you just play in a very strict way. Don't go for big upgrades. Don't have a shitty build and then think, I'm gonna get Ralph's Burial, it's gonna fix my build. Instead, upgrade this, upgrade this, upgrade that. 200 FE there, 200 FE there, 500 FE there, 500 FE there, 200 there, 100 there, 300 there, 400 there. Eventually you come out to like this 10,000 that you need for Ralph's Burial, but you gained 10 times the amount of damage Ralph's Burial would have given you. Because all that Ralph's Burial is flat damage. But does that flat damage matter if you have no additional damage to multiply it with? No. And until you get that flat damage, you can just craft flat in your gear. You can just get flat from other sources. And then once you have your Ralph's Burial, you replace all those sources of flat. I really hope this does help people. Just some other notes. Penetration essentially just works as an additional damage multiplier. If you work under the assumption that all enemies have 30% elemental res and 50% armor resistance, for elemental-based damage builds, which Erica plays, that is equivalent to 30% elemental res and 30% armor res. So if you have 70% pen for armor and 70% pen for elemental, then that is the same as having 40% additional and 4% additional. Why 40% not 70? Because we first need to minus the 30 to get them to 0. And then every point we take them into negative res, we are doing additional damage to them. As for damage conversions, the way damage conversions in this game work is that if you convert from multiple elements, any additional multiplier that you have before converting will apply after converting too. So if you have 30% additional physical damage and you're converting from physical to lightning, that 30% additional is still going to be applied to the physical hit you do afterwards. That is why, like, you see very often that Gemma 1s will do a triple conversion from first to lightning, from lightning to cold, and from cold to fire. From fire to cold. Because at every step along the way, they can have additional damage modifiers for each element, and they all will stack together. That is why she is also one of the strongest aura stackers, because she has access to more auras than everyone else. Also, just side note, lucky crits in this game does not work like PoE. Lucky crits will literally literally calculate your chance to crit, if it was lucky, and just give you flat crit. So, let's say you have 50% crit rate. Instead of literally just rolling the crit twice, it will just give you 25% crit, because if you were to roll the 50% twice, it averages out to 75%. So it just gives you 75% crit. This is important because that causes lucky crit to not stack. And if you have like multiple sources of lucky crit and a single source of unlucky crit, they will all cancel each other out, and it's essentially that you have no lucky crit. So there's no way to like bypass unlucky crit by having two sources of lucky crit. Okay? And also having two sources of lucky crit does nothing for your build. Another thing, there's a curse limit in this game. You can only apply one curse on an enemy at a time. I've seen a few people who have no additional curses in their build, who are running two curses. You can't do that. It will never apply two curses once, it will only have one curse, and the other curse is completely useless. You need to either have Poised Omen, either take the talent that gives you additional curse, or have the candle mod, which gives you an additional curse. Okay? Anyway, YouTube, this has turned up into a bit of a ramble. It's a very complicated topic. I don't think, most people will be able to just watch this video and understand this, but this is all in my guide sheet for Erika 2. And you can like read through my notes. You can read through not only my notes, but very detailed and dumbed down explanations to try and make it as simple and easy as possible to understand. I'm not calling you dumb, but I think oftentimes having things explained in a very simplistic manner makes it a lot easier to understand, because not everyone has a math degree. Not everyone has the same comprehension of numbers that like each other has. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching. Please leave a like, comment, subscribe, all those beautiful things. And I'll see you all again another time, YouTube. Bye, YouTube. Bye, YouTube. Bye. Meow, meow, meow.